Okay, in this video, we will talk about muscle metabolism. Now, before we get into muscle metabolism, there's a few words and a few things that you should go over in your mind's eye to review. So, some of those things to review is the Krebs cycle. You should, jot that term down, Krebs cycle or cellular respiration, um, mitochondria, aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration, glucose, glycogen, glycolysis. These are terms that you're going to be hearing, and it's good to kind of have and know what this vocabulary means. Okay, so how do muscles derive ATP necessary to power the contraction? This is the same way of saying how does muscle derive energy necessary to power the contraction cycle? Well, we have creatine phosphate, we have anaerobic respiration or anaerobic glycolysis, and cellular respiration, which is aerobic respiration. Now, this term glycolysis, when you look at the word lysis means to break down. Well, to break down what? To break down glucose. And when glucose is broken down, it's broken down into pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Okay? So at rest, muscles produce more ATP than it needs. So ATP transfers a phosphate or some energy to creatine. So we have ATP, it joins forces with creatine. So this phosphate right here becomes part of creatine. So ATP loses a phosphate. When it loses one, it's going to become ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And creatine gained the phosphate, so it's called CP. Okay? And remember, during each contraction, the myosin head breaks down ATP. It needed that ATP, producing ADP and the phosphate again. Okay? If we look down below, we can have ADP can join up with creatine phosphate using an enzyme, creatine phosphokinase. And when it uses that enzyme, now this phosphate leaves creatine, joins ADP, and becomes ATP. And then you're just left with creatine. CPK is found in all muscle cells. If it crosses a cell membrane at a fast accelerated rate, and it's measured in blood in excessive amounts, it means that there's muscle damage. Maybe the person was doing, and I've had a patient, and I've done CrossFit for years and years, been a power lifter for years. I've had a patient that ended up with severe rhabdomyolysis. He was not a healthy individual, was exercising intensely, and his muscles started to break down at an accelerated rate, was in the hospital for a few weeks, and was urinating black urine, and very, very dangerous stuff. You have to be really smart when you're doing high intensity training and make sure that you're nourished properly and that you don't overdo it. Anything in excess is dangerous. Anything too little could be dangerous as well. They measure CPK also if heart muscles are damaged, like in a heart attack. Those enzymes can be high. So here's creatine, and here creatine is joining with ATP. And when these two join, ATP loses a phosphate, becomes ADP, and creatine picks it up, and you get creatine phosphate. Now, if we need energy, the ADP, adenosine diphosphate, joins forces with creatine and becomes ATP. Okay, this is a really important cycle. It uses creatine kinase. That's going to catalyze the transfer of those phosphate groups. Creatine kinase is creatine phosphokinase, or CPK, that we talked about here. Okay. Now here is the mitochondria. Here is glucose. Glucose is in the cytoplasm of a cell. And when glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid, the breakdown is called glycolysis or glycolysis. Now remember, this takes place not in the mitochondria. Glycolysis takes place where? In the cytosol. Okay? It's in the cell, but it's just in the cytosol. If oxygen is available, right, you're exercising, you're not huffing and puffing or out of breath, pyruvate can enter the mitochondria to become part of the Krebs cycle, which can make some ATP. But if you're out of breath, if you're exercising so hard and you're in an oxygen debt, you don't have enough available oxygen to drive this, pyruvic acid becomes another type of sugar called lactic acid. Okay? And lactic acid can become pyruvic acid again, and I'll show you that cycle called the Cori cycle. But it only becomes that it only can recycle back to glucose when oxygen is available. So that's why when people are exercising and they have no energy left, they're huffing and they're puffing, they're huffing, they're puffing, they can't go back into exercise, especially with high intensity training, until they regain some oxygen left. When oxygen is available, pyruvate or pyruvic acid can enter the mitochondria, enter the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle makes some ATP, not a lot, much like glycolysis can make ATP, but not a lot. The breadwinner here is the ETC, the electron transport chain. That's where all of the majority of the ATP is produced right in here. But the Krebs cycle makes coenzymes. And the coenzymes are used to transport electrons here into the electron transport chain. Okay, this is where a lot of ATP is produced. The electron transport chain needs iron, and it needs coenzyme Q10. Okay, iron and CoQ10 to produce ATP. The Krebs cycle needs your B vitamins, B1, B2, B3. It needs your B vitamins to run the Krebs cycle. Okay, the electron transport chain needs iron and a lot of CoQ10, which is why women during the time of month when they're bleeding and they're losing blood, they're losing iron, they may not have the best energy. Okay, and if you don't have iron, you can get that iron deficiency anemia. You're fatigued because once again, you can't make energy. Okay, so when creatine phosphate stores are depleted, so let's say the person was doing a power lift or exercising. For the first few seconds, not long at all, CP, creatine phosphate, is gone. And when it's gone, we still need energy. Glucose is now converted into pyruvic acid to generate ATP. Again, that is assuming oxygen is available. If oxygen is not available, pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid that goes into the blood and can go into the liver. We call that the Cori cycle. So the Cori cycle is part of removing the and recycling any lactic acid by the liver. And it converts the lactic acid back to pyruvate. Once you have pyruvate, you can recycle glucose. So here, let's say we have glucose. The person is exercising, so we need energy. The process of breaking down glucose into pyruvate is called glycolysis. Now, pyruvate can go into the mitochondria, assuming you have oxygen available. If oxygen is not available, pyruvate is converted to lactate through this enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. Lactate is going to go into the blood, find its way into the liver. Now you're resting, you're breathing, you're gaining your oxygen levels back, and while you're resting, lactate can be converted back to pyruvate, back to glucose by that same enzyme, lactate dehydrogenase. Here, we're producing glucose. That's called gluconeogenesis. gluconeogenesis, producing new glucose. Gluconeogenesis. When you have glucose and you're breaking it down, it's glycolysis. So don't confuse those terms, glycolysis with gluconeogenesis. Under aerobic conditions, meaning you have oxygen available, pyruvic acid can enter the mitochondria and undergo a series of oxygen-requiring reactions to generate energy. So here you've got pyruvic acid from glycolysis can enter the Krebs cycle. Fatty acids, triglycerides can be shuttled here for fuel. From protein, you can get amino acids. That can be broken down here and used for fuel. As long as you have oxygen from the hemoglobin in blood from myoglobin in the muscle fibers. Now you can form some ATP. You also produce heat. You're giving off water and carbon dioxide, which is what we exhale out. Okay? What can produce muscle fatigue, right? Muscle fatigue is the inability to maintain force of contraction for an extended period of time. So the onset of fatigue is due to maybe an inadequate release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You don't have enough calcium, you're not going to be able to contract hard enough. Maybe there's the depletion of creatine phosphate, that energy source, depletion of oxygen, or depletion of nutrients, B1, B2, B3, protein, fats, carbohydrates, CoQ10, iron, right? It can come from a buildup of lactic acid and ADP, or just not having enough acetylcholine. That's an excitatory neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. So why do we continue to breathe for a period of time after stopping to exercise? To pay back the oxygen debt. We got to get the oxygen back up to normal levels. The extra oxygen that we are breathing during resting is going to replenish the creatine phosphate stores. It's going to help us convert lactate back to pyruvate, reloading oxygen onto myoglobin. Okay? Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about different types of muscle fibers, red fibers and white fibers, and fast and slow twitch fibers.